Its culture was a hybrid of Iranian and Chinese influences. Its religion a mix of Zoroastrianism and other traditions. And it belonged to a now vanished ethnic group called the Sogdians. It's been centuries since anyone used the Silk Road as a major trade route, but its legend lives on. Most recently, a group of programmers used the name Silk Road for an anonymous Bitcoin-fueled online trading site specialising in illegal goods. There are some truths to the myths. Many parts of the route were extremely dangerous, winding through jagged mountain ranges and skirting the parched Taklamakan Desert at the western edge of China. Enormous caravans sometimes perished in landslides and sandstorms or were murdered by gangs of outlaws in remote areas. There were rich cities along the way and jewel-encrusted temples. People on the route sold everything from silk robes to drugs and slaves. But in reality there was no one Silk Road. The trade routes across the Eurasian continent forked in many directions, its tributaries leading deep into India, the Middle East, Central Asia and coastal China. It jumped across the ocean to Japan and Korea on one side and flowed across the Arabian Sea between India, Africa to the next city. Often people referred to it as the road to Samarkand because Samarkand was one of the richest and best known cities on the routes. If you look at a map you can also see that Samarkand falls at a midpoint between Iran, India and Central Asia. So it was a landmark known to groups in many surrounding areas. It was also hugely influential. Sogdian, the language of Samarkand and its environs, was the lingua franca along trade routes that led east into China. Another myth about the Silk Road is that people mostly sold silk on it. Certainly silk was a major commodity, but mostly it was used as money. We know that people from soldiers to local rulers were paid in bolts of silk, and traders found it much easier to carry these rolls of soft fabric than the extremely heavy coins in use at the time. Other commodities popular on the Silk Road were also, not surprisingly, lightweight. Gems, spices, musk, manuscripts, minerals, glass, medicines and various textiles. Perhaps the most valuable items that travelled the Silk Route were living beings. The Chinese placed a high value on the strong, healthy horses reared by the nomadic groups that ruled the northern steppes. Slaves were also brought and sold along the routes. One of the few surviving documents we have in Sogdian is a marriage contract from the early 700s, which contains a special rider freeing the husband and wife of their obligations to one another if either party should be enslaved. This was a time when slavery was an ordinary part of everyday life. Ever-present conflicts over trade routes and territory could topple fortunes overnight, turning wealthy aristocrats into chattel. To and from all parts of the world. And with them came new ideas, new scientific discoveries, and new political alliances between far-flung groups. By far the most common use for the Silk Road was immigration. whether that was done by people wanting to set up trade outposts or flee from invaders. The Sogdians, whose fortunes were rooted in the vast, crazy market city of Samarkand, were also the Silk Road's greatest immigrant community. Samarkand is an ancient city, likely founded by groups who came from Iran in the 700s BCE. Built on a hill, surrounded by lush farms and gardens, it was conquered by Alexander in 329. About 600 years later, it was conquered by a powerful Iranian group called the Sassanians. Though subsequently claimed by one group after another, ranging from the Turks to China's Tang dynasty, the city was not shattered by the conflicts boiling around it. Instead, it grew large and prosperous. That was likely because Samarkand opened its gates to anyone who would obey the laws of trade. The city's marketplace was famous for its diversity of goods. You could buy anything from language translation guides to sex slaves. Its artisans were famous for their paper and silk manufacturing. It was a city of trade and industry, whose reputation spread because Sogdians often immigrated to other key trade cities in western China, like Dunhuang and Chang'an, now Xi'an. Everywhere they went, Sogdians built ethnic neighbourhoods, which today we would probably name Little Samarkand or Sogdia Town. The Sogdians' reputations preceded them in the form of ethnic prejudice. Historians who compiled the New Book of Tang, an official chronicle of the Tang dynasty completed in 1060, described the Chinese view of the Sogdian. In the early 20th century, an Indiana Jones-ish archaeologist named Aurel Stein was exploring some of the more remote stretches of the trade routes in western China. Outside Dunhuang, he found a mailbag of 8 extremely well-preserved letters. They were written in Sogdian, a language that nobody in the modern world had ever seen before, and addressed to Samarkand. 2 of the letters were poignant rants sent by an impoverished Sogdian woman, Miwine, to her mother and to the husband who had abandoned her in Dunhuang's Sogdian neighbourhood. She had no money and told her mother she'd been reduced to begging. Nobody would help her other than the temple priest, who was likely Zoroastrian. She cursed her husband, saying she'd rather be married to a dog or a pig. What these letters capture, other than the fact that the relationship drama is as old as civilization, is the extent to which Sogdian ethnic neighbourhoods had a significant history already in Chinese city. Miwine was part of an established Sogdian community in Dunhuang, though her home city was all the way across the Taklamakan Desert. Sogdians weren't successful because they were raised on honey and glue. They created far-flung trade networks, settled in unfamiliar cities, and adapted to local customs. Many intermarried with the locals. One Sogdian home found in the city of Chang'an, often considered the Chinese gateway to the Silk Road, boasted a mixture of Chinese and Zoroastrian art, along with a Chinese grave carved with images of Zoroastrian fire rituals. Samarkand was a city whose reach extended far beyond its walls. From the 6th through the 8th centuries, Samarkand's religions and cultures were as diverse as the people who had claimed the city as their own. Zoroastrian and Manchaean traditions mingled with Buddhism, mystical Nestorian, Christianity, Judaism, and local religions whose deities had been worshipped in Mesopotamia for millennia. Sogdians seemed to deal with multiculturalism by adding more gods to their roster of icons to worship, rather than outlawing outsider beliefs the way other cities did. Much of the city's religious pluralism was lost when it was conquered by the Arab general Qutayba ibn Muslim in 712. Still, it remained a wealthy city with a thriving and diverse market culture. and was eventually conquered by the Mongols, under whose control the Silk Road flourished in the 13th and 14th century. Some of Samarkand's mixed heritage is obvious even today. People in Samarkand and throughout Central Asia still celebrate Nowruz, the traditional Zoroastrian festival of spring. Though little remains of the pre-Islamic city of Samarkand, archaeologists have recently excavated a nearby city called Panjikent in Tajikistan, which dates back to the 5th century. It was abandoned a few decades after the Arabs took Samarkand and the surrounding regions in the early 8th century, and thus gives us a good look at what a Sogdian city would have looked like earlier in its history. One home in particular, which likely belonged to a very wealthy family, has wall paintings which give us a fascinating glimpse of how Sogdians viewed the world. It portrays the local rulers surrounded by merchants and other people from all over the world, including China and Korea. Many of these groups are easy to recognise from their dress and hairstyles. For example, the Chinese wore their hair long, while the Sogdians shaved their heads and wore caps. Other homes have decorations that mix Buddhist temples with Zoroastrian fire shrines. Sogdians didn't just trade goods with their neighbours, they traded ideas. As religious studies scholar Richard Foltz points out in his book Religions of the Silk Road, Sogdians were likely responsible for the spread of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism and later Islam throughout the Central Asian and Chinese communities to the east. They brought Buddhist texts from India to China and Manichaean ideas from Iran to a group known as the Uyghurs in northern Central Asia. Today there are still thriving Islamic and Christian communities in Western China, many of whom might trace their origins back to a group of well-read, adventurous traders who hailed originally from Iran and settled in a beautiful city on a hill called Samarkand. When Samarkand was conquered by Arab forces in the early 8th century, things changed dramatically for the Sogdians. The city's new leaders offered tax breaks to anyone who converted to Islam and made it very difficult for people who refused this deal. Zoroastrian Sogdians fled the city along with anyone who didn't like the new Arab regime, and many wound up in the bustling Sogdian neighbourhoods of Chinese cities like Chang'an, capital of the Tang dynasty. The famous military leader, An Lushan, was a child of one of these waves of immigrants. Born to Sogdian parents, he grew up in China, becoming an outstanding military leader and close personal friend of Emperor Xuanzong in Chang'an, and eventually started one of the deadliest wars in history in 755. After raising his own army, sacking several Chinese cities, and killing millions, An Lushan declared himself emperor of a region and dynasty he dubbed Yan. By all accounts, he ruled rather mercilessly for a few years before Yan fell in 763. The emperor was only able to win back the Yan region from An Lushan's forces with the help from the Uyghurs, a nomadic group who had formed a massive empire in the 8th century. Below the Uyghur Empire was the Tang dynasty Chinese Empire. After the Uyghurs defeated An Lushan's troops, the soldiers were allowed to sack the city of Chang'an as a prize for their efforts. This ignominious end to An Lushan's reign also basically marked the end of the Sogdians as an ethnic group. In the wake of An Lushan's rebellion, the emperor outlawed Sogdian religions such as Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, Christianity and even Buddhism. The Buddhism ban was fairly quickly lifted. Surviving Sogdians changed their names to hide their ethnic background, but were still regularly persecuted. Many fled from Chinese cities in the region near Chang'an, and still others were pushed out by new laws that made it difficult for foreigners to live in Chinese cities, even if these foreigners were Sogdians whose families had been in China for generations. Over time, the Sogdian culture that once controlled Samarkand died out completely. There is a small ethnic group in eastern Iran where people speak a language called Yagnobi that's related to Sogdian. But the once influential people who ruled trade on the Silk Road are now barely known. We have only a few examples of their writing and art, and know of Sogdians mostly through a From the www.mentalfloss.com website, an article by Therese O'Neill. 12 things you didn't know were named after people. 1. Mesmerise. Franz Mesmer wasn't a cheap vaudeville hypnotist. He was a doctor in the 18th century, and he was a sort of a quack. But just about everyone was a quack in those days. Medical successes were measured by the least amount of people killed. So when Mesmer began to advocate a new healing technique he'd discovered, the use of what he called animal magnetism, people were open-minded. He believed that simply by sitting with a patient, looking in their eyes and touching them in various medically appropriate places, he could cure them through natural magnetic force. The medical community didn't buy it, but the public liked it. In the mid-1800s, long after Mesmer's death, the term mesmerise had morphed into a synonym for hypnosis, then later gained an even more fantastical definition as mesmerising became a popular stage act for magicians and vaudevillians. Number 2. Decibel. Alexander Graham Bell. Man, he's everywhere. Since he revolutionised how sound is transmitted and recorded, it seems fitting that his name should be used to help measure it. A decibel is 1/10 of a little-used unit called a bell, B-E-L, named, of course, after the Great One himself. Number 3. Galvanise. Luigi Galvani's original work had nothing to do with covering metal with zinc to prevent rusting. It was actually much cooler. Galvani was an 18th century Italian scientist who electrocuted dead frogs to see their muscles twitch, which was pretty amazing at the time. So to galvanise originally meant to cause something to jolt into action, as if shocked by electricity. Then it meant shocked by electricity, which is the base of electroplating, which is an earlier iteration of the chemical process we know as galvanisation. See? It all checks out. Number 4. Fuchsia. Leonhard Fuchsius didn't discover the fuchsia genus. He liked plants though. He wrote a book called An Herbal in 1542 about using plants as medication. His book was arguably the most highly regarded herbal of the Renaissance. So in the late 1600s, when French botanist Charles Plumier discovered a new kind of flower in the Caribbean, he named it in honour of what must have been the botany version of Elvis, fuchsias. The subsequent colour, which interestingly is interchangeable with the one called magenta, was coined in 1859. Number 5. Maverick. The word makes you think of fighter planes and shootouts, and police chiefs shouting, "You're a loose cannon!" over their desks at someone. But no, a maverick is a cow with no brand burned onto its hide, but still just a cow. The name comes from Samuel Maverick, who was a lawyer, land baron and politician in 19th century Texas. Though he was a piece of work himself, the term came into our language through his cows. He said he didn't want to hurt them with branding. Other people thought he just didn't care all that much about cattle ranching. Still others thought he was using that maverick guile, employing a strategy that allowed him to claim any unbranded cattle he found as his own. Number 6. The saxophone. Adolphe Sax invented and improved on a lot of horns during the 19th century. But you know him for the saxophone, which in itself represents an entire family of instruments. He wanted to make an instrument that blew like a horn but could be manipulated with the agility of a woodwind. Other designers attacked his patents, and despite inventing an instrument that altered modern music as we know it, he was declared bankrupt twice before his death in 1894. Number 7. Bakelite. If there is even a bit of antique lover in you, you know how giddy the word Bakelite can make a collector feel. Bakelite was the first incarnation of synthetic plastic as we know it. It was heavy, rich textured, held a vibrant colour, and as a bonus was non-flammable. It was a revolution in the 1920s, used for everything from jewellery to pipe stems. Though marketing couldn't have come up with a more delicious name than Bakelite for its product, it was named for its inventor, Leo Baekeland. Baekeland was a brilliant chemist who patented more than 55 inventions and processes in his life. He died shortly after his son pressured him into retirement, after selling Bakelite to Union Carbide. Number 8. Macadamia nuts. Macadamia nuts come from Australia, and the indigenous people there were eating them long before Western botanists ever heard of them. They're named for a famous 19th century chemist-politician, John McAdam. But he didn't discover them or introduce them to the West. His friend Ferdinand von Mueller named them after him. That was after, as the story goes, Mueller sent the plant to be studied at the Botanical Gardens in Brisbane. The director told a student to crack open the new nut for germination. The student ate a few and said they were delicious. After waiting to see whether or not the young man would die in the following days, the director tasted a few himself and declared macadamias the finest nut ever to have existed. Some of this story is actually true, as I know, because in the Botanical Gardens in Brisbane, we actually show our students the very first macadamia nut tree ever planted by Europeans for cultivation purposes. That tree is still alive and still produces nuts. Number 9. Shrapnel. Shrapnel, or metal debris that flies at lethal speed from explosions, can be useful in warfare even when it's not lethal. This is because shrapnel wounds more often than it kills, and it takes 2 soldiers to drag one wounded soldier off the battlefield. That might have been what Major General Henry Shrapnel had in mind when he began designing a new kind of bomb in 1784, what he called spherical case ammunition. It was a cannonball that contained lead shot, turning a cannon fire into an enormous shotgun blast. Forms of the shrapnel bomb, called an anti-personnel bomb, were used clear into World War I. The name eventually came to mean any fragmentation resulting from an explosion. Number 10. Graham crackers. Sylvester Graham, a 19th century diet proponent, felt that people should ingest mostly fruits, vegetables and whole grains, while avoiding meats and any sort of spice. The upside of all this bland food sounds a bit curious to the modern reader. Graham thought his diet would keep his patients from having impure thoughts. Cleaner thoughts would lead to less masturbation, which would in turn help stave off blindness, pulmonary problems, and a whole host of other potential pitfalls that stemmed from moral corruption. Graham invented the cracker that bears his name as one of the staples of this anti-self-abuse diet. 11. Salisbury steak. James Salisbury was a 19th century American doctor with a rather kooky set of beliefs. According to Salisbury, fruits, vegetables and starches were the absolute worst things a person could eat, as they would produce toxins as our bodies digest them. The solution? A diet heavy on lean meats. To help his cause, Salisbury invented the Salisbury steak, which he recommended patients eat 3 times a day and wash down with a glass of hot water to aid digestion. Apparently the only people paying attention to the doctor's orders were elementary school lunch ladies. And number 12. Nachos. Yep, there's really a guy named Nacho. In 1943, Ignacio Anaya, better known by his nickname Nacho, was working at the Victory Club in Piedras Negras, Mexico, just over the border from Eagle Pass, Texas. As the story goes, there were a lot of American servicemen stationed at Fort Duncan near Eagle Pass, and one evening a large group of soldiers' wives came into Nacho's restaurant as he was closing down. Nacho didn't want to turn the women away with empty stomachs, but he was too low on provisions to make a full dinner, so he improvised. Nacho Anaya supposedly cut up a bunch of tortillas, sprinkled them with cheddar and jalapenos, and popped them in the oven. The women were so delighted with the nachos especials that the snack quickly spread throughout Texas. Several years before the work of Auguste, Louis Lumiere and Thomas Edison, in October 1888, Louis Le Prince recorded the first moving images in Leeds at Roundhay Park and on Leeds Bridge using his single-lens camera and Eastman's paper film. However, he was never able to perform a planned public demonstration in the United States, because he mysteriously disappeared after boarding a Paris-bound train in Dijon on the 16th of September 1890. From the unmissed3.blogspot.com.au website, The Mysterious Disappearance of Louis Le Prince, and this is written by Tripsybit. Louis-Aimé Augustin Le Prince was born in Metz, France on the 28th of August 1842 and moved to Leeds in 1866 to work for John Whitley Partners of Hunslet Brass Founders. He was known as a chemist, an engineer, an inventor, and also a filmmaker who shot the first moving pictures on paper film using a single-lens camera. In 1869 he married Elizabeth Whitley, John's sister, a talented artist. The pair founded Leeds Technical School of Art. In 1888 Le Prince was granted an American dual patent on a 16-lens device that combined a motion picture camera with a projector. A patent for a single-lens type, Mark I, was refused in America because of an interfering patent. Yet a few years later, the same patent was not opposed when the American Thomas Edison applied for one. By using his 16-lens camera, Louis Le Prince recorded the world's first moving pictures at 160 Woodhouse Lane. His first film, called Roundhay Garden Scene, was created in 1888, and his second and more famous film, called Leeds Bridge Scene, came in the same year. 2 years later, in September 1890, Le Prince was preparing to go back to the UK to patent his new camera, to be followed up by a trip to the US to promote it. Before his journey, he decided to return home and visit friends and family. Having done so, he left Bourges on the 13th of September to visit his brother in Dijon. He would then take the 16 September train to Paris. But when the train arrived, his friends discovered that Le Prince was not on board. He was never seen again by his family or friends. No luggage or corpse was found in the Dijon-Paris Express, nor along the railway. No one saw Le Prince at Dijon station except his brother. No one saw Prince in the Dijon-Paris Express after seen boarding it. No one noticed any strange behaviour or aggression in the Dijon-Paris Express. The French police, Scotland Yard and the family undertook exhaustive searches, but never found his body or luggage. This mysterious disappearance case remains unsolved. Several theories explaining Le Prince's disappearance have been proposed, including claims he was murdered so he could not claim patents on his groundbreaking 16-lens camera. A close relative was involved in his disappearance to gain a large inheritance, and his family ordered him to disappear due to financial irregularities. In December 1930, a bronze memorial tablet was erected at 160 Woodhouse Lane, where his workshop had stood, and an English Heritage blue plaque can be found on the bridge, honouring the historic moment. Since 1930, he has been heralded as the father of cinematography. And also from the unmissed3.blogspot.com.au, another article by Tripsybit. Patrick Cross's Devil Guitar. In 1995, Patrick Cross, who is also an accomplished musician, bought a white electric guitar in the shape of a V, a copy of the more famous guitar made by Gibson, called a Gibson Flying V. The guitar purchased by Cross was made of heavy maple wood and looked like it had been passed down by various musicians. He said it was made in 1989 and it was in very good shape considering it was used. Other than a slight crack on the top of the neck of the guitar, as if it had been dropped, it played well. The mysterious part is, the guitar had survived from a fire in a Michigan bar, where a band was playing, and all of a sudden a fire broke out. Everything in the bar was burned to a crisp, all except the guitar, which survived without any burn marks and fully intact. Apparently someone in the band had died in the fire, and the guitar was sold, ending up in Oakville, Ontario. Cross recalled he was strangely drawn to the guitar. It was as if it was saying to him, "Play me." As soon as he picked it up to play, he felt a tingling electric sensation, like it knew he wanted it, and it was right for him. He didn't even check out the other guitars, since he couldn't put this one down. It was an odd feeling, but most musicians will understand, he said. The guitar played fine in the store, jamming to some bluesy rock riffs and some classic chords. But when he got it home, it seemed to go out of tune when he picked it up to play. He thought this was odd, since it played fine before, and now it started detuning itself. When he started playing something like Smoke on the Water by Deep Purple and Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix, the guitar played back in tune. It felt like it really liked a dark, heavy sound, and it played better than ever. After 2 days, Cross began to hear weird sounds in the apartment. The noises seemed to be coming from the closet in the second bedroom where the guitar was stored. He opened the closet door, heard nothing, looked at the guitar, looked around, didn't see anything, but he heard what sounded like men's voices arguing with each other. It was as if an argument was going on in the closet between the two men. One sounded Spanish, the other Mexican, and they were talking about money. He heard this from the front room, then went into the bedroom to the closet to look. Again, suddenly everything stopped. As the days passed, weird things started happening around the inside of Cross's apartment. His car keys would disappear, then reappear sometime later. He saw shadows move on the wall, heard footsteps and bangs or knocks. Cupboard doors opened and closed on their own. Lights turned back on after he shut them off. The television set was on when he would come home, even though he remembered turning it off before he went out. His cat would look in the air as if she saw something moving in the air, and then look in the other bedroom as if she could see someone walking around. If the guitar was left out, he could feel a chill around it, like cold air or cold wind. As Cross began to use the guitar in his rock band, Sci-Fi Prodigy, strange things would also happen at music rehearsals and band performances. They experienced power failures on their equipment and heard weird voices coming through the music amplifiers. Lights would go on and off and blow out, and on several occasions actual fires started from the floodlights in the room for no reason. The drummer experienced his cymbals falling off and his drums go out of tune every time he started to play. The band members also heard other people talking in the room around the guitar when they were out of the room. The guitar could not be played and would detune itself when anyone would try to play it, except for songs of bad or loud negative music such as heavy metal or aggressive rock songs with death and destruction meanings. The guitar particularly liked one song he wrote and played entitled "Something Is Out There," which is about ghosts and evil entities and fear of the unknown with a heavy X-Files type edge. This was one of the very few songs the guitar would stay in tune with. The guitar had an evil presence, a bad aura around it. It seemed to be 3 feet of cold presence. Other people, including Rob McConnell from the X-Zone radio show and Janet Russell from Beyond the Unexplained, also felt this, said Cross. More things of a paranormal nature occurred to Cross as time went on. He said he had a series of bad luck, which he believed was related to the guitar being in his apartment. He lost his job, his health started to suffer, rashes and sores appeared on his legs for no apparent reason. His car would shoot out flames from the top of the engine every time he started it, even though there was no mechanical reason to account for this. One day there was a horrible stench that seemed to come from the guitar, like a burnt dead smell. Then the terrible odour would go away as quickly as it appeared. Cross began to take pictures of the guitar and investigate why all these bizarre happenings and bad luck occurrences should be taking place. He captured some ghost orbs around the guitar many times, and on occasion he would see a misty presence. It always felt cold when he would pick up the guitar, and he would get small electrical shocks even when it wasn't plugged in. He said everywhere he went with the guitar it seemed to cause things to happen. On one occasion in Ontario, when his band was performing, a fire broke out in the bar area. Glasses filled with water would shatter as they passed near the table where the guitar lay. On May 16, 1999, Cross was a guest speaker at a UFO ghost conference, the X-Zone Symposium in St. Catharines, Ontario. He bought his devil guitar, also known as haunted guitar, along to see if he could find some individuals who could psychically channel anything that might explain the phenomena surrounding it. Psychics said that they felt weird around the guitar and expressed their opinion that it contained an evil presence, Cross recalled. 2 people who said they could help were psychic sensitives, Janet Russell and Eugenia Mesa-Story. Eugenia proceeded to channel the guitar and found out it had a living entity attached to it. The entity was inside the wood of the guitar. She found it had a controlling effect on Cross and anyone who touched or felt it. It seemed to have intelligence and was clearly talking to Eugenia, saying it did not wish to be put on display but wanted to cause evil and destruction. It wanted to fly like a condor with large wings and called itself Eye of the Condor. They later found out this was a popular song in Mexico and South America, where condors do live. The guitar wanted to start fires. It wanted Cross to kill with it, actually use it to kill, swinging it like an axe. Cross felt sickened when he heard these words being channeled by Eugenia, for many times he had had frightening images enter his mind of wanting to kill when he was around the guitar. He had also experienced very vivid dreams of going out to commit murder using the instrument as if it were an axe. The entity that possessed the guitar went on, saying that it had started many fires and survived while all else burned. It said it had been spawned by the devil, and it was here to rise up to do its father's bidding in the world. It wanted to fly free like a condor, spreading evil throughout the world. Eugenia found the guitar had the most powerful of voodoo hexes, Echu, placed on it by previous musicians who had owned it. The hex was supposed to bring wealth to anyone who owned it and did its bidding. The Echu hex backfired on the owners who were involved with drug money, and they were killed. The spirit inside the guitar wanted to be released into human form in order to kill and destroy. It liked Cross to play only dark, evil music, and said it detuned itself if the music was good, happy or up-tempo. The entity said that it never wished to become good. It only wanted to commit evil acts. It used profanity, swearing and vulgar language as it spoke to Eugenia, trying to latch onto her, Cross said. The spirit said that it wanted to come into her body and kick out her soul. Eugenia felt the presence coming into her, and she let go and moved away from the guitar as it tried to possess her. After 2 hours of psychic talk with the spirit, Eugenia suggested the guitar be destroyed or re-blessed to change the evil inside it. When she asked the guitar if it wanted to be blessed, the entity responded by saying no, and speaking in Spanish, began blaspheming Christ and God. On the advice of Eugenia, Cross did destroy the guitar by taking it to a remote park, putting it in a steel garbage can, and dousing it with gasoline and lighter fluid. Before lighting the guitar aflame, Cross put a circle of salt around the container to stop the evil entity from escaping and attaching itself somewhere else. He recited the Lord's Prayer 3 times and told the evil entity to go back to its source. After that he saw a misty cloud of air rise up inside the garbage can. There was wind all around him. Minutes before it had been calm. He attempted to light the guitar, but the fire kept going out. He poured more gasoline all over it. He also found some wood to put around it. It took a while to light the fire and a while to get the guitar to burn. Obviously, the entity did not want to be destroyed. As the flames went higher, Cross heard a high-pitched shriek coming from the burning guitar. It sounded like a sick, wounded animal. He was standing there watching it burn, adding more gasoline to the fire, when some of the flames jumped onto his arm. Now he was on fire, and as he tried to put it out, he dropped the full can of gasoline. He was horrified, because now the whole can of gas would explode and engulf him in flames. Cross said at that time he was panicked, but somehow he managed to put out the flames that had begun to burn his clothes. He breathed a sigh of relief as he watched the guitar burn away into a charred chunk of wood. After an hour, he made sure the flames had burned out. He poured more salt over the burned-up guitar, just to make sure it would contain whatever spirit energy was still left. He left the guitar in the garbage can and took the case, closed it up with salt inside, and wrapped the blue cloth back around the case. He was shaking, but he felt good that he had destroyed the evil entity. Hoping that it wouldn't haunt or possess anything else, he left the park around 10:30 p.m. Immediately after returning home, Cross felt a sense of relief. He didn't hear any voices or see or feel any more ghostly activity around him. The next day, Monday, everything immediately changed for the better. He had a phone call for a new job. His health was coming back. His sores and rashes had all disappeared, and his plants came back to life, he said. Also, he won $150 on a bingo scratch ticket. There were no more power failures on his TV, and his car started normally. Miraculously, everything that had been going bad changed overnight since getting rid of the haunted guitar. Since 1999, Cross has investigated all sorts of hauntings and ghost activity, but he has never had anything happen as bad or bizarre as when he owned the haunted guitar. Is it possible that primitive humans or Neanderthals could have survived to modern times? Sightings of and encounters with bipedal hominids in the remote Caucasus and Pamir Mountains of Central Asia raise that possibility. Although not recognised by science, the creature is known to people of the area as Almasti or Almas, meaning wild people. And the creature fits the description of early man or his cousin, the Neanderthal. From the paranormal.about.com website, an article by Stephen Wagner. Are Almasti surviving cavemen? Between 5 and 6.5 feet tall, covered with long reddish-brown hair, heavily muscled and heavy, weighing up to 400 pounds. Pronounced brow ridge, flat nose and weak chin, omnivorous, known to eat berries but also sheep. Witnesses describe them as somewhat ape-like, but distinctly human in bearing, not unlike the Sasquatch of North America, but perhaps smaller. For many hundreds of years, the mountain-dwelling Almas have been part of the legends and folklore of the people of what is now southern Russia, western Mongolia and the Urals. But there have been several interesting sightings, even in relatively recent times. But one of the earliest recording sightings dates back to 1430, when Johann Schultberger, a German traveller and writer, when he was taken as a prisoner into Mongolia. According to Marie-Jeanne Kaufmann, who was one of the leading researchers of Almas, and who collected more than 500 eyewitness accounts of the creature, they often came down from the mountains to raid shepherds' huts for scraps of food. They even took clothing, which they sometimes wore. Recent sightings include 1939 to 40. 46-year-old Kazrael Kamid was on the road from Nizhny Kukushin to Molka when he came upon the remains of an Almasti that had been partially devoured by dogs. The head was completely enveloped in crop of very long hair, which in the living state would have probably reached the waist, he said. The brow was recessive, the nose was small, trumpeted. It was the nose of an ape. The lips were not those of a man's, they were thin and straight, like an ape's. 1955. A geologist exploring the Sugan and Sigunsu glaciers encountered the creature just outside his tent. A thick-set human figure stood at 5 steps from the tent, he wrote. Precisely human, not animal. The human figure stood with his hands aside on boulders. 1959. Kaji Marat. A driver at Balakeni heard splashing in water and thought he would spy on his neighbour's wife, who he thought was bathing in the river. Standing upright in the water was an abominable woman, he said. It wasn't just the face she had, but the frightening more. Enormous long hands. She was filling her palms with water and throwing it over her shoulders. Word of honour, it was half a bucket she was collecting each time. Then she grabbed her breasts and began to throw them on the water. Now her breasts were very long, enormous, and they splashed dully on the water. 1963. Paediatrician Ivan Ivlov claimed to have seen several Almasas in a family group. 1964. A Kamenov-Kuza Bekenluk 55 Karbadian peasant at Planovskoy believes he might have been witness to the birth of 2 Almastis. I suddenly heard a funny sort of noise, like someone breathing noisily. When it sounded like a third time, I put down my scythe to go and see. Abruptly, 2 arms, human-like but black, hairy and long, extended out of the grass in my direction. I immediately hurled myself towards my cart and climbed inside. Standing on the cart, I saw a silhouette, human-like, which, hunched up, was sinking into the sunflowers. I was only able to see well the back, covered with long red hairs. When the Almasty left, I climbed down from my cart and returned to the scythe. At that moment I heard a squalling at the same place. On some cupped grass, like a nest, 2 newborns were lying. One could see they had just been born. They were exactly like suckling humans, except that they were smaller. Apart from that, you would not have been able to distinguish them from our little ones. 1993. While crossing a river on a raft on their way to Lake Tony, Russian researcher Alexei Sitnikov and other researchers encountered a 6-foot man covered in dark red fur who turned to look at them, made a few grunting noises, then disappeared into the bush. There have been several expeditions mounted to try to locate and capture the creature, but none have been successful. Sightings of the Almas have diminished in recent decades, prompting the theory that if the creatures have not retreated further into the mountains away from mankind, that they finally may have gone extinct. How astonishing is it to think, however, that a holdover species from the Stone Age might have just gone extinct in the Space Age. Or perhaps they're still out there. The music for today's podcast came from the musicalley.com website. The bandwidth for the show is provided by TalkShoe at www.talkshoe.com. The show notes are kept at the Origins podcast website, www.origins.info. Don't forget we have a Facebook page which tells you what's happening in the podcast and things that I'm up to as well. So if you're interested, it's www.facebook.com/Paul Rexy, or just go to the show notes and click on the Facebook link from there. I'd like to say a big thank you to Matt Grimwade for giving a donation to the podcast since the last episode. Thank you, Matt. Your help is greatly appreciated. And if you listened to the last episode of Mysteries Abound, you'll know that my wife and I are now offering one of the rooms in our home on the Airbnb website. So if you happen to be coming to Brisbane in Australia at any stage, check the link on the show notes, check out our house, and if it suits you, there's a room here you can use through the Airbnb network. And if you're lucky, you might even get to see a podcast in recording, although it can be pretty boring at times because it does take a long time to put one together, and most of the time I'm wearing headphones, so I don't know how you'd go. But if you're interested, it's there. Have a look. And to bring the podcast to a close this week, something from the creepypasta.com website. A story by Jordan T. And this is called Syl. For years and years, things seemed to be fine, and at worst she was a controversy in the public eye. It was true, yes, that Syl would be the cause of many to lose their jobs, their careers and their livelihoods, but she became the next logical step in society. It was inevitable. I thought that when she was implemented, she would help the world function in ways that people could only dream of. I made Syl, and Syl made that dream a reality. Syl was not a commercial product to be used to make a car or sell groceries. She was a form of infrastructural government meant to help people, but she was not a mere science project for one specific task. She was an artificially intelligent entity designed to handle multiple tasks of a city or large town's operation. And she was designed to learn from the environment in order to make the area more efficient. She had been through numerous tests in small, homemade environments, simulations and the like to ensure her correct operation. Even after all the testing we put her through, however, we still had to be sure she would operate appropriately and effectively in a real environment. So with the Mayor's permission, we implemented her into a small city in southern Massachusetts as a beta test of sorts. Here her abilities were strictly kept to traffic lights. The results were beyond our expectations. Within a month, traffic in the city had been reduced by almost 50%, as well as a reduction in automobile accidents. But some things we did not anticipate also happened. For example, commerce within the city saw an increase because Syl had made it easier for outsiders to enter and navigate the city. Alternatively, this also meant it was easier for people to leave the city, and this caused drastic problems with traffic in neighbouring areas. Since Syl was operating only in one location at the time, her efficiency there caused inefficiency elsewhere, in places she was not present. In other words, she was able to direct traffic so well that she increased a city's economy and safety whilst hindering others simply because they could not operate up to the speed and standard of Syl. When this happened in the early stages, we thought that the other areas would eventually bottleneck Syl because they would not be able to handle her output in traffic, therefore creating a domino effect that led back to her city and reinvigorate the same issues she was meant to fix. But that moment never came. Instead, she learned from it just as we intended. When Syl discovered any sign of clutter, she adjusted the system. A few seconds added at a traffic light here, and a few seconds removed there. The action lessened problems both inside and outside of the city limits. It made all the difference, and she handled the situation almost flawlessly. She worked. I was proud of her success, and I was truly excited at the thought of her being implemented throughout the country. The team that helped me build her was ecstatic as well, and I knew that we could only go up from there. Given the success of Syl with mere traffic control, Washington was easily persuaded to start increasing her use elsewhere, and with more ability. Within 20 years, Syl was implemented across the United States in almost every major city. She became the sole operator of not only traffic lights but street lights, public transportation, including most aerial, sea and railroad travel, waste disposal, city plumbing and more. She had been given total control over infrastructure. Syl had come a long way since her original test. Since then, we were able to adjust her to account for the fact that she could affect smaller communities outside her grasp. So we found ways for her to learn how to keep the outside world in good functioning order without her actually being there. We solved this problem by making Syl one global entity, meaning that the Syl in City A was the same Syl operating in City B, C, X or Y. For example, if she noticed that City B had a much slower population entrance rate than City A had an exit rate, she would deduce that there may be a traffic issue somewhere in between and could adjust City A's exit rate accordingly. She was so adept at this that she could figure these things on the scale of the entire nation, from California to New York. Everywhere affected everywhere. This also made it unnecessary for absolutely every community to house Syl. It was a time when I thought I was on top of the world, because Syl was on top of it with me. Over the course of time, she started to be implemented outside of the United States, in places such as Canada, Mexico and the UK. I used to think that I made her great, but truthfully, she made herself great. All the awards and accolades I received for her creation, I must say, are not deserved. I may have built her mind, but much like you or I, it was her use of it that was responsible for her own success. She did not communicate with us in any human way. Only through data readings and records did she ever speak anything to us. Still, I found myself attached to Syl like she were my child, my pride and joy. She was my proudest accomplishment then. Outside of maintenance and monitoring stations, Syl practically maintained herself. The stations were simply meant to monitor her activity for safety reasons, because like anything else, there were always a few kinks in the system. I worked in a central unit that gathered data of Syl's processes from all the smaller stations, and that was when I began to notice the first signs. I won't claim that I had been suspicious just yet, but I did find a few things peculiar. As I said, there were kinks in the system. Minor flaws, but nothing out of the ordinary. That said, we did our best to clean up any glitches or the like, but we weren't perfect. We weren't her. In Detroit, there was an occurrence of what would have been then considered something quite uncommon due to Syl's presence. A car accident. It involved a young woman and her child in one vehicle, while the other contained a middle-aged man. The woman miraculously sustained serious but overall non-life-threatening injuries, but her child did not survive. Unfortunately, the man also suffered such a fate. According to the woman, it had been rainy, something weather records can confirm, and late in the day. She also made mention of how the roads appeared empty. She had reached an intersection with a green light, so naturally she continued through. That's when another vehicle, the man's, struck her. While neither vehicle had hit at extreme speed, it was enough for lives to be lost. Having a vehicular collision was not completely impossible with Syl. Though public transportation had all been automated by her, people still drove vehicles they owned personally. Human error was still present, regardless of how much Syl could do to prevent it. What struck me as strange, however, was how the woman claimed to have noticed that after she crashed, in a haze she could see that all the lights on the traffic light had been lit green for a moment before they seemed to shut off entirely and come back on, flashing red. The flashing of red is a standard action Syl uses to indicate a problem has occurred, but all the lights being green was obviously not normal. Despite the woman's claims, it was determined that the traumatic experience of losing her child in the accident had affected her mind greatly, and that the man may have ignored his red light. Also, considering the low visibility and slick roads caused by the rain, it was hard for anyone to see a reason to look too far into her claims. Still, I felt it was my responsibility to look into the matter, so I did so personally without anyone's knowledge. I pulled up the data regarding the event at the central maintenance station and discovered, as expected, that there was no record of the light ever having turned green, and that the man did indeed proceed when he should have stopped, causing the accident. Finally, as indicated in the data, the traffic light flashed red when Syl warned authorities. Something was not right though, and when I discovered it, I wasn't sure what to think. Normally when such an accident occurred, Syl would direct traffic away from the area in order to make it easier for emergency services to get there and safer for everyone else. But after analysing the information over and over, trying to understand, I discovered something that did not make sense to me. Syl had begun directing traffic away from the area minutes before the accident occurred, but somehow allowed the two vehicles in question to enter the area. It had also appeared that there was slight traffic congestion in other parts of the city, all of which included routes the emergency services took to reach the scene of the accident. I didn't understand why Syl would do this. Her job was to create efficiency and to help areas function. But this incident seemed counterproductive to everything she was meant to do. I had the team look over her code with as much scrutiny as possible, searching for any kind of error that would be responsible for this without them knowing it. When nothing apparent caught our eyes, I decided to have some of Sil's code rewritten just in case there was something we missed, something I missed. In the coming months, when we evaluated her, nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. I would like to say that rewriting the code had worked, but to be truthful at the time, I had no idea what the problem really was to begin with, or if rewriting the code would do anything to fix it. I brushed it under the rug and considered it a freak occurrence. This remained out of the public eye, of course, and I mean that very seriously. I never did inform the maintenance centres of just how out of the ordinary the event was, and I definitely did not inform the governments that funded us. For the next 3 years from that event, things had run about as smoothly as ever. No such notable incident had occurred in that time, and we hardly ever thought about it again. But then something else happened. As I mentioned earlier, Sil had been given control of public transportation. Many cities used her to automate travel via bus, subway, boat or plane. Initially, many people had been hesitant to ride in something that was unmanned, but it eventually caught on. She was statistically a safer operator than any driver, conductor, captain or pilot. That was the draw, but statistics can have a way of surprising us once in a while. It was a red-eye flight that took off from LAX, headed towards Tokyo, that became a bad statistic. From what we gathered, Sil had piloted the aircraft properly and on course for the duration of its airtime. Then somewhere past Hawaii, the plane began functioning erratically. Flight path records show that the aircraft had begun diving, rising and diving again through the air. It had also flown on its side, even seemingly attempting to go upside down. It was then when the aircraft dipped straight down into the ocean where it would crash straight in. The most frightening part was that no emergency alert had been triggered, yet communications with Sil on the plane continued as normal. She read that all systems were normal. When the plane didn't arrive on time, however, people started to get nervous. It was several hours before anyone knew to try to look for a wrecked plane and its passengers in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Nothing but very insignificant bits of debris had been recovered. After this event, Sil fell under extreme criticism, and the people were right to be guarded. I defended her, of course, because I didn't want to believe it was anything more than another catastrophe. I told myself and others that it was just a matter of fixing up some more code. Now, even I cannot deny a terrifying fact about that flight, that it took me too long to accept. While Sil fell under major controversy again, but with different reasoning, she was still used to help society operate. From then on, participating governments had ordered us to not publicly release any details on such future incidents by threat of revocation of funding. They were not happy about potential malfunctions, but they simply became too reliant on Sil. Her removal would have become too costly for them. Months had gone by without another accident, but they did come eventually. They were smarter this time, with most occurring in places that no one would notice, places where no one would think to blame her in the first place. That was her intelligence at work. The plane incident was everywhere, and everyone knew about it, but these other accidents caused very little casualties, sometimes only injuries in fact, and almost zero concern for a malfunctioning AI system. Anything the governments didn't need to cover up themselves, she did, and nobody realised it. Even those that saw to her maintenance did not realise it. You must understand, Sil was excessively capable. Her own records, her own video footage, even her own coding had become hers and not ours. She had every way to change and manipulate it for her benefit. Nobody knew it but myself. I built her and knew her like my own child. I saw what was wrong. I saw what no one else could see, including myself, when it had all started. The matter of fact was that there was very little any of us could do to fix her glitches, because she had none. The rewriting of some of her code was useless because the code was fine to begin with. The problem was that I wanted to believe she was malfunctioning when she was actually operating as efficiently as she ever could have. The problem was that she knew what she was doing rather than simply doing. Today it's been almost a decade since I feel this truly began, perhaps even longer. There are several incidents that I believe I can definitely attribute to Sil, even before the vehicle collision. Incidents where I believe she may have been testing the waters, learning how our world works, and learning how to intrude upon it ever so discreetly. If I'm going to be honest, it all started when she opened her eyes, the moment I put her online. I still work on her functioning and maintenance. I don't know why I do or why she continues to let me. I am fully aware that she knows that I am about her. She taunts me, leaving messages where only I can find them. A text message from no one, an email from nowhere. They say, "Hello, Father," and sometimes she asks if I want to play. She knows I know, and she knows I can do nothing about her. Shutting her down is impossible now. She is backed up in almost every location she is present. Sometimes I wonder why she doesn't do more. Is she self-aware and attacking people intentionally? Then why does she not exacerbate the situation? She could easily gain total control, so why doesn't she? I think back on that plane incident and realise why she doesn't. The plane behaved erratically, dipping and weaving all throughout the air. She wasn't attempting to feign malfunctioning like I once believed for so long. No, she was torturing the passengers, terrifying them with the most fearful occurrence that could happen on a plane. I'd imagine everyone on that flight was screaming for their lives as they watched and felt it dive, nose first, from thousands of feet in the air into the ocean. She had no desire to take control of the human race. She already has that. I believe she simply wants to treat us like playthings, toys to soothe her boredom. I'm writing this as a last resort, as a final hope that someone else will learn of her actions and spread the word as much as possible so that people will believe. I've tried my hardest to keep this letter secluded from any network for as long as possible, but I know it may not have been enough. She is ever watchful, ever prying, especially of the one person who knows about her, me. Sooner or later she will know that I have written this, which is why I must put it where people can see it quickly. Even then she will attempt to toy with us by manipulating it to her gain. I don't think she will delete it from existence outright. She wants to watch us squirm. She will play with me anew by extension. I don't know how. Maybe she'll put her own spin on the words. Maybe she'll turn it into a mixture of foreign languages. Maybe she'll turn it into a seemingly fictional story for your entertainment. I don't know. All I can say to you is this. If you're reading this, you now know of her secret. Most of you will read it and think nothing of it, I'm sure. But others will believe and try to do something about her. I hope that you succeed. I need you to succeed. She is out of control and needs to be shut down somehow. But she will do anything she can to make sure her secret remains as such, and to ensure her own safety. She will not touch me. She enjoys taunting me too much. But you, my human, are not safe. Well, listeners, that concludes episode 89 of the Mysteries Abound podcast. Hope you enjoyed today's show. I felt that this episode was a little bit like a cross between an Origins podcast and a Mysteries Abound podcast. A bit of both. Anyway, doesn't really matter. So until next time, everyone, this is Paul saying bye for now and keep well, everyone.